Welcome back to the Church Growth Strategies course. I want to deal with one more issue, and that is, or movement, and that is the church growth movement. So let's just jump right into it. In 1955, pastor and missionary Dr. Donald McGavran of Fuller Theological Seminary founded a movement called the Church Growth Movement. His first books were Bridges of God and How Churches Grow. They were published in 1954 and 1960. The seminal idea of this strategy were birthed in his missionary activities in India. There he saw Western ideas and traditions as crumbling and unhelpful in reaching the various castes amongst the Indians. In 1965, about 10 years later, Dr. McGavran founded the School of World Missions in Pasadena, California. The focus of the school was to encourage research and spread the gospel in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By 1972, the principles used overseas were now being applied and adapted to the American scene. Now, of all the church growth strategies, this one is the most prolific, including such authors as Donald McGavran, Win Arn. I would classify Lyle Schaller in this category, even though he feels he's kind of on the fringe of it, and C. Peter Wagner as some of the most prominent and prolific writers in this area. There's many, many more. In fact, this particular type of church growth strategy is so prolific, we're just really skimming the surface in me giving you an overview of it. Its principles have been used in churches such as the Church of the Nazarene, the Evangelical Covenant churches, Southern Baptist churches, Missouri Synod, Lutheran churches, virtually every mainline denomination. However, most mainline denominations were suspicious of the movement at first. By about the mid-60s, their losses in their membership were so frightening, and the denominations as a whole were declining, these mainline denominations, that loss was accelerating for about through the next decade, from 1965 to about 1975. They eventually turned to this particular movement for answers. And from this movement developed the first church growth consultants. A few of the most prominent characteristics of this movement include the following: gathering statistics on church attendance and membership, as well as setting measurable goals. You'll find those are probably the two major categories of characteristics in this strategy. Demographics, data gathering, statistical analysis, and then setting measurable goals and going through steps and processes in order to fulfill those goals. They believe numbers say a lot about the church as to whether it's growing or it's stagnant. And as with other church growth methods, there's an attempt to balance between quality and quantity, and you'll hear that talked about over and over again as you read their materials or listen to their audio recordings. However, this movement attempts to quantify both in hopes of discovering objective information on whether or not a particular church or denomination is growing or declining. So whether it's qualitative or quantitative, their goal really is to find, well, what's the raw data? And they feel the raw data speaks for itself. This movement finds its roots in foreign missions. So it was the first strategy to apply cross-cultural missions and evangelism techniques to the American church. Now, driven by both an evangelistic and a cultural mandate, that is the Great Commission, and a concern for the whole person, those two elements also have come into play in the developing a church growth strategy. Interest in contextual as well as institutional factors have been studied in an attempt to discover mainly why are these mainline denominations declining. To make research even more difficult, they found that not all denominations in a particular area were declining. In the same county and during the same time period, evangelical denominations were growing vigorously, while others had lost in excess of 1 million members. A good example of that would be between 1965 and 1975, the growth of the Southern Baptist Convention and the 1.1 million members lost in the United Methodist Church. C. Peter Wagner published what he calls 7 vital signs of a healthy church. I'll give those to you in a second, but I would strongly recommend that you read Mark Deaver's 9 Marks book. And he's got a number of them on what is a healthy church, what's a healthy church member. But, they all stem from this organization called 9 Marks. And the 9 is the Roman numerals, capital I, capital X. And the reason for that is because he believes there are 9 marks of church growth, or healthy churches, healthy church members. And he goes through more of a pietistic approach, where this is a more pragmatic approach. C. Peter Wagner offers these 7. Number 1, a pastor who is a possibility thinker and whose dynamic leadership has been used to catalyze the entire church into action for growth. That's one criteria that's needed, or a vital sign. Number 2, a well-mobilized laity which has discovered, has developed, and is using all the spiritual gifts for growth. Number 3, a church big enough to provide the range of services that meets the needs and expectations of its members. Number 4, the proper balance of a dynamic relationship between celebration, congregation, and cell. All right, what it's talking about there is it's talking about, the celebration is the worship service, the celebratory, and the cell groups are the personal, where the needs are met. The congregation would be like kind of mid-sized groups. Number 5, a membership drawn primarily from one homogeneous unit. We'll talk about that in a second, because that's been probably its most controversial principle. Evangelistic methods that have proven to make disciples. So the idea is, the end game is discipleship. And number 7, priorities arranged in a biblical order. So there you have, in a nutshell, what the process is for church growth movement strategies. Now, one of those, as I mentioned, controversial principles advocated by the church growth movement has been this homogeneous unit principle that we saw here in number 5, list above. Let me just explain what that is in a nutshell. It's likes attract like. It's more effective, it's easier to reach people like you than people who are not like you. Cross-cultural, or trying to break social barriers, is not as helpful as we thought it was. Many people thought that's what missions was all about, cross-cultural barrier breaking, when the truth of the matter is, you go within a culture, you find its natural breakdowns, and you work within that structure. This principle was first discovered by Dr. McGavran in India as he attempted to reach beyond the caste system. What he learned was that evangelism was easier and more effective if done within the caste system rather than ignoring the established social boundaries. The point is that likes more easily attract likes. Furthermore, for a church to grow, its self-awareness needs to be homogeneous. In other words, you need to be able to look at yourself and say, we are this people, and it's one type of person, not a plethora of races, ethnicities, economic status, educations, things like that. Furthermore, for a church to grow, it needs to be similar enough that they can agree on the essential purpose, direction, and the means by which they can reach their goals for growth. Moreover, they will grow more easily if they concentrate on reaching individuals most similar to themselves. So that's one of the key and possibly the most fundamental principle in the system. Another principle advocated by the church growth movement is one that relates to the use of effective tools of communication and advertising to achieve church growth. If you remember back in the 80s, if you were involved in church growth 30 years ago, there was a program entitled Phones for You, which was basically a telemarketing program using telemarketing techniques to generate interest in a new organization called the church being planted in your community. So what they did is they used communication tools and advertising, print, broadcast, telemarketing. They use that to stimulate and or birth churches, or to help them grow. A third principle that finds its roots as far back as when Dr. McGavran was the executive secretary treasurer of a missionary organization. He was serving 70 missionaries in India. Is the relationship between time, money, and people. And again, these are important things, though some of the ways they were applied, people think are a little crass, but there is a relationship between the time expended, the money spent, and the people used. What he saw over in India was that between his missionary organization and all the other missionary organizations that were working, the results were minimal. And he thought, if you're going to spend that much time and money and people on a particular project, it should be more effective. That frustration led Dr. McGavran to conclude a major factor in the slow growth of churches was a massive buildup of a defensive thinking. That's why they moved into that kind of positivistic thinking, which again, that in of itself is very controversial in Christian circles as to whether that's even biblical. But he did find this massive buildup of defensive thinking and rationalizing as to why they weren't growing. That rationalization was almost used as a justification, so they didn't feel bad about not growing or growing very, very slowly. A second factor in this dynamic was that most churches lacked the facts on growth or decline of the congregation and denomination. In other words, they didn't really know what the numbers were. And a third one was that he noticed that different types of people responded to the gospel differently. In other words, he classified people as resistant and then mildly resistant. And the key was find the mildly resistant people and work with them first. Don't go after the most resistant people. It's difficult to list all the principles used in the church growth movement, but here is their definition of a church growth principle. A church growth principle is a universal truth which, when properly interpreted and applied, contributes significantly to the growth of churches and denominations. You'll find this in the 10 Steps for Church Growth, 1977, page 15. In summary, the church growth movement believes its purpose is very close to God's purpose. Second, the church growth can be most simply understood as biblical missions on the home mission field. And the movement claims to have discovered reproducible principles of growth that has developed means by which these growth principles can be objectified. And it has developed strategies that link the growth principle to the growth problem. And you'll find that a lot of growth principles stemmed out of a particular identified problem. The whole idea is to break down those barriers to growth. Here's a fourth principle. I'm kind of throwing a lot of these out at you because there's so many, and this really characterizes the movement. Church growth principles are found in various disciplines. Not only does the Bible give instructions as to how God builds His church, but you can also discover this through natural revelation, such as through the science of anthropology and sociology. And these principles equally contribute to the development of church growth. And here is where there's been some major debate in at least conservative Christian circles. And by conservative, I mean theologically conservative circles, saying that the principles of psychology, sociology, anthropology, the demographics kind of stand on their own. They're not raw data, but they actually tell you particular things at the same caliber or level as special revelation, that is the Bible. Here's a good example of how this is applied in the church growth movement. They love lists, and they love simple lists. And here are a couple of them. There are three types of church growth, they say. There's internal growth of Christians in grace and their relationship to God and towards one another in fellowship. Number two, there's expansion growth of the church through the evangelization of non-Christians within the church's target area. And number three, there's extension growth of the church by establishing daughter churches. So you've got internal growth, expansion growth, and extension growth. There's also three ways to increase church growth. Number one, biological growth as members have children. Number two, transfer growth as members from one church unite with another church. Number three, conversion growth as people are converted to Christianity. Again, you see kind of the simplistic breakdown of categories of people. Here's another one. There's three ways a church decreases in size. Well, number one, death of its members. Number two, transfer of members to another church. Number three, the reversion of members who renounce the Christian faith or stop the involvement in the local church. So again, very simple kind of categories. You either die, or you leave to go to another church, or you give up your faith. Those would be the signs of a church decreasing. There's four classifications of evangelism, and this was a classic breakdown of trying to understand where you are with an individual as you're sharing your faith with them. They call this E0, E1, E2, E3. E0 would be this: winning a nominal Christian back to the faith. E-1 would be evangelizing a non-Christian in your own language and culture. So that would be like an American Christian in an inner city sharing the gospel with an American Christian in an inner city. They understand each other. E-2 would be evangelizing a non-Christian in a similar language and culture. In other words, you would go over to, say, Great Britain or Wales. In E3 would be evangelizing a non-Christian in a radically different language and culture, such as what Dr. Donald McGavran did. He went to India and Pakistan. Here is another 10-step church growth process for growing a church that would, and this reveals again that the pattern of how they're using what they're doing. So here's an excellent example of what you would look for in creating a strategic church growth movement model. Number one, discover church growth principles that apply to your location. Number two, respect biblical principles, but also discover principles through sociological and anthropological studies. Number 3, discover and yield to God's purposes for a growing church. Number 4, give effective evangelism priority over other concerns. Number 5, rightly discern the reasons for why the local church is not growing. Number 6, rightly discern the needs and interests of the community the church is located in. Number 7, find new ways to start groups and to disciple young Christians. Number 8, learn to reproduce the church through other churches. Number 9, develop superstructures to sustain growth over the long term. And number 10, be willing to take risks to grow. I've rifled through those really quickly. You can review this recording and try to get all those down, but that would be an example of the steps that you would go through in a local congregation to apply the church growth movement principles. Here are some of the strengths that we find in these. I know they're simplistic lists and they require a lot of explanation, and that's why there's such a plethora of writings in this subject. But again, let me just very briefly touch on the strengths of this strategy. Number 1, the greatest strength, I think, of the church growth movement is it offers an honest look at why churches are failing. You have to stop and you have to be honest with yourself in a career. Why are you stagnant? Why are you on a plateau? Why are people leaving? Why are people not attracted and coming? That honesty and objectivity is very helpful to start with. Number 2, the focus on evangelism and discipleship as the beginning and end process of church growth, I think, is undisputed with all the strategies. Number 3, the use of various disciplines to develop creative means for discovering what works in a particular area, the willingness to take risks, and the openness to experimentation are often required to learn what will grow a church within its social context. You need the data, you need the raw information, but I think you have to understand that these demographics are just that. They're not principles. You have to interpret that data, and the question is, what principles are used to interpret that data? And that's where we start getting into some of the weaknesses of this model, is that they're assuming that their interpretation of the data is common sense. It's obvious. It's not. People spend a lot of time and money with consultants trying to properly interpret data or to weight data so that they can find something that's correlative, that's significant in the data. Number 4, the definitions and steps to follow are communicated in simple terms, making the principles accessible to those seeking to learn about church growth dynamics. This is one of the most attractive or marketing techniques that the church growth movement uses in and of itself for its own purposes. The simplicity of it all. It just seems so simple. The categories, there's basically 3 categories. I mean, people can keep that in their heads, and they can take that to the real world. That's definitely a strength that they have. Number 5, the focus on numbers gives at least some indication of the success of each attempt to grow a particular church. You keep records of what you're doing, and you find out how many people responded to this particular program. Now, here are some of the criticisms that I would have with this strategy. And again, this is just a sampling. There's a lot of things I have concerns with this particular movement. Number 1, the idea that growth principles can be discovered through special and natural revelation is a bit too broad. Especially when you start equating anthropological studies with theological principles. In other words, the Bible gives a very clear principle here that God builds His church, but sociologically, we realize that it's interconnected networks amongst people, and that's really why they're coming. That's challenging the issue of how does the Holy Spirit function and operate. I think it'd be better to describe the principle that if it's in the Bible, it's usable, and if it's not in the Bible and it's not considered unbiblical, it's principle. Now, that really is a foundational principle for this movement. In other words, if the Bible doesn't say it's wrong, then you can use it. Again, very broad concept here. And as a controlling growth principle, I'm just personally really uncomfortable with that. The same thing with the regulative principle in worship. Just because it's not stated that you can't do this doesn't mean that you can do those particular things in church. And a lot of conservative scholars really start to buck the system at this point because there's no real biblical foundation warranting that. And it can get you into real dangerous areas, such as putting your confidence in your mass marketing and putting money into beautiful brochures, thinking it's the beauty of the brochure that's attracting people. Now, it may attract people, but if you don't attract people based upon the gospel, then really who are you attracting to your church? Numbers don't give the full description of what's happening spiritually within a congregation. The entire movement is driven by both a Great Commission mandate and pragmatism. And again, a lot of truth in that. The issue is about balancing that. The problem arises in that the pragmatic appears to be more concrete, and therefore it's easier to focus on. You can count the nickels and the noses, so you jump in there. In other words, the ends justify the means. Again, the church has gotten itself historically into a lot of trouble by moving in those directions, and there's a tendency here to depend upon the strategy in and of itself and not the Holy Spirit. Number 3, although the demographics are helpful, the issues of counting nickels and noses can be discouraging to young pastors and pastors of small churches and declining communities. In other words, this idea that God wants every church to grow has not been my personal experience. I think certain churches reach a saturation point within a community, and that's where they stop growing. And they can continue influence, and they may be constantly sending people out, and with that absence of those people, bring new people in. But numerically or statistically, the church doesn't show growth. That is not a sign of an unhealthy congregation necessarily. But it can be really discouraging to a young pastor when he goes into a church of 50 people and finds out 5 years later it's still 50 people. He may feel like a failure because of the statistical drive within the church growth movement. The notion that God wants numeric growth because he offers the gospel freely, I think, ignores a key biblical principle, and that's the idea of the remnant. There have been times in church history where the church has actually shrunk in size. Now, that's not a sign that the church was unhealthy or that it was failing. It's a sign of the times, but it's not a sign that the church is not doing God's will. Also, I think this fails to ignore that there's life expectancies to churches. There's limits to size and resources that again, are natural part of the cycle of all organizations within that community. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the church being the size of 40, 50 people. Some churches, that's just their DNA. And they can be very healthy and instrumental. And they might not send out 1,000 missionaries, but they might send out 2 or 3. Now you think about that. You get 1,000 churches sending out 2 or 3 missionaries. You have 2,000 or 3,000 missionaries being sent out, as opposed to 2 or 3 churches sending out, a dozen missionaries. You get 24 or 50 missionaries being sent out. So the multiplication is seen in the broader spectrum of the whole church with a capital C, and not the little small local churches. Now, the simplicity, as I mentioned earlier about this model, is its strength. It's also its weakness. Numbers have to be interpreted, and the interpretation of the data is the devil of the details. How do you interpret these? It's so easy for a layperson to interpret data incorrectly, to claim there's correlative data. In other words, this relates to that, or this causes that. Causal relationships in raw data, from a sociological, communicative, psychological perspective, is the most difficult data to discover and to interpret. It's not simple and it's not easy. See, we need to be careful about how we use those numbers. Determining which understanding of the facts reveals a growth principle is kind of like a dog chasing its tail. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see into that data what you want to see. That's where you begin to lose the honesty that you got from the raw data. If you could just have someone who understands how to interpret raw data into the real world and show the relationships of the data one to another. Again, correlative relationships are the most difficult thing to prove, and the church movement has a tendency to jump to conclusions. They've seen this pattern, therefore it must be. That doesn't make their interpretations valid. Number 5, success is defined both spiritually and numerically. That's a good thing. But again, the focus too quickly defaults to the numerical. Again, it's the pragmatism in the system that really irritates a lot of people. Furthermore, success criteria becomes the ultimate theological concern, or the ultimate theological criteria. In other words, if it works, it must be right. If the church is growing, well, then you're doing something right. Maybe, maybe not. The point is that God is not the only one who adds numbers to the church. Satan can bring entire families in the church. And again, I've seen this, where they've devastated a congregation. Initially, it looked great, but you lost the ability to interpret that growth from a biblical perspective because you didn't use biblical principles. Also, quite frankly, people joined the church for the wrong reasons. I knew a church that offered $20 to everyone who came to church. This is really true in one of my communities. And that church grew. what does it say when you go to church in order to get money? You're paid to worship God? Isn't that idolatry? So there are principles, marketing strategies, anthropological dynamics, and culture that quite frankly are just immoral. They're inappropriate to use. And part of the reason for that is in the end game, what are you really producing? You're bringing people into the church that possibly are not believers, and they're being put in situations where they're making decisions for the church. Now that is unhealthy, regardless of how many of them you have. And finally, number 6, the question used to discern God's will is, what's the most effective for the most people? Again, here's that pragmatic element kicking in here, where that's not always the case. Church government, for the most part, is representative. The pastor represents God to the people and the people to God. There are all types of dynamics like that in the relationship of Jesus Christ to his church that does not appear, initially at least, to be the most effective for the most people. Good example of that is suffering. Now, we can say ultimately suffering is in the best interest of the church, but when you're looking at the day-to-day statistical analysis of the church growing, suffering is depressing, suffering is difficult, suffering is discouraging. Even though long-term, and we can't see many times why we're suffering or the value of the suffering, but we know by God's grace, there's a key principle, that suffering is important. Another one is persecution. The book of Acts, chapter 2, the church scattered. I'm sure everybody thought that was a failure. It wasn't until a decade later, when Paul was doing his missionary journeys, that places like Antioch and Rome had enough exposure to the gospel and some converted Jews that congregation cores could be established and churches could grow. But again, initially, and sometimes for a decade or 15 years, there was no sign of statistical growth. That would have looked like a failure. That's a long time in a church's history. In modern times, especially in the postmodern world, to say we're not seeing any statistical growth for 15 years. My whole point in this is that what's most effective for the most people is so pragmatic, you really can't see that, and you really can't say or answer that question. It's amazing also how God uses the impossible to do something. Never would have imagined something would happen. I went into a church one time, first time I preached there wasn't a single child. Within 18 months, they had 20 children in the congregation. That's the impossible. How did that happen? Yeah, we can go back and look and see the networks and find out how things happen. Could we have strategically developed a plan and implemented that? I think only at the best, partially. That was clearly a move by God's Spirit. Another dynamic that you just cannot quantify or statistically analyze or put into a strategy is, what do people think of the church? What's the image the church presents to the congregation? The word gets out on the street, oh, this church is growing and it has more children than any other church. Or this church has got great preaching. I mean, it's clear and it's plain and I take it home and I can use it. Testimonials like that within the community can't be planned. And yet oftentimes people will come to church because of the spread of the word. How do you strategically design for that to happen? And yet that is a significant factor. I'm going to take a break here, and we're not going to go into the missional church movement and analyze that, but I will give you some notes that have my material on that. But that's going to be some of what's on the exams and the testing for you, as far as I want you to take now Dr. Keller's book on the missional church movement, and I want you to come up with what is his basic structure and how that's applied, and give some strength and weaknesses to that. So at this point, we're going to stop, and our next talks, we're going to go to some concluding thoughts.